Now for the not-so-good aspects. Despite how much I really like the meteor missile might effect, its featured sequences are not always perfectly executed. Every once in a while, you'll spot some errors with the missiles that were left in the final cut. You see, when Zone Fighter uses his missiles, they don't always fire rapidly. In a few shots, they'd fire a couple of rockets before suddenly freezing, then suddenly continue firing, and then freeze again, and then continue firing again at the same pace. And other times, they'd launch in a slower pattern than usual, while the sound of them being shot out rapidly is accompanied in the background, appearing inconsistent to what's being shown on screen. In some instances, the editor tried to work through that issue by simply omitting the delayed shots, and then splice the shots together in an attempt to make the firing of the missiles seem more continuous. I'm really not sure if that was helpful or not, as to me, it just expressed how cheap these shots truly were. It's great that we have King Ghidorah appear in 2 episodes, but there are numerous shots of him flying that are so cheaply executed when compared to how he was displayed in past films. In most of his flying shots, we see a miniature prop of Ghidorah that's highly unconvincing. It barely even comes close to resembling the suit. His wings don't even flap as he flies, when in past films like Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Monster Zero, Destroy All Monsters, and at least a few shots in Godzilla vs. Gigan, the shots that were in stock footage, that is, it was usually his suit that was used in each of those sequences. And in each of those flying shots, we saw Ghidorah flapping his wings, as any aerial predator really should, in order to move through the air and whatnot. It was certainly more convincing than watching an obvious puppet soar through the air. When danger is afoot, the Zone siblings have 2 vehicles they use either for transport or for physical combat against the enemy. Smokey, which is generally always piloted by Zone Angel and Zone Junior, and the mighty Liner, which is mostly piloted by Zone Fighter. With the pull of a lever, Hikaru's car will produce a pair of wings, and will also retract its wheels, turning it into an aerial combat machine. It can fly above the landscape, and even in outer space. It can fire rockets from its hood, and can also create multiple split images of itself, which can decoy the enemy. On land, the Liner is an actual car, with a pair of wings propped on either side, which was kind of surprising to see, considering the amount of shortcuts Toho had to take with this series to compensate for the effects costs. In the air, the Liner is a model that's controlled by wires. Summoned out of the 4th dimension with the call of its name, Smokey is a small flying saucer Angel and Junior used to aid Zone Fighter against his struggle with a Kyoju. It possesses a cannon that fires an effective beam that is strong enough to knock a Kyoju back a few steps, and can even take down a Garoga saucer in just a single hit. When Zone Fighter's energy is dwindling, Smokey is equipped with a multitude of canisters that are used to replace the zone marker, replenishing his energy back to 100%. Though, how many of these markers can be held in the contraption at a given time, as well as where and how they're manufactured, is never actually specified. But who cares, I guess.
Garoga! Come on, Liner!
Both inventions were actually pretty innovative concepts for an oldies sci-fi series. The effects for both contraptions were equally hit and miss, but I actually favor the way both Smokey and the mighty liner were brought to life on screen. I just thought I'd mention one last decent visual accomplishment before continuing with the rest of the negatives. While the Ultraman series almost always features a battle in the city with an opposing monster, Zone Fighter only had one episode that involved a city fight. This was the 4th episode, which coincidentally was also the first episode to feature Godzilla in the series. The other 25 episodes showed a fight that was either set in the countryside, a refinery, a small village, or another planet. Since the latter sets proved to be much more cost-effective to produce, Toho had to rely on filming their effects scenes in these types of locations to compensate for their budget. I won't deny that I really like the settings of the battles, but it just seems pretty unusual that an evil race of aliens bent on world domination is expressing its destructive power on regions that are fairly uncrowded and very little damage is being caused to the country except to a few huts, trees, and mountains. There were still a couple of episodes that featured a Kyoju at least ravaging its way through a Japanese city, like Zandola, who collapsed a city from below by his means of burrowing his way through the ground. Afterwards, the episode just ended with a fight between Zone Fighter, Zandola, and Godzilla somewhere in a secluded landscape, nowhere near any populated regions. In episode 25, the second to last episode, Kabuto-Gira smashed his way across a small town in a sequence that barely lasted a minute. Rather than having him fight Zone Fighter in this partly decimated suburb, Kabuto-Gira first marches his way out of the community into a much more green and semi-isolated terrain, and then the two fight. What a shock, right? To me, the one episode that stood out in fully expressing the show's budget was episode 22, titled Counterattack, Defeat Super Jikaro. I said that the series never reused Kyoju suits for later monsters, but in this case, it was sort of half true. 21 episodes after his first appearance, Jikaro is finally featured again, but this time in the form of Super Jikaro, which doesn't look at all different from his former incarnation, minus one or two new abilities. Aside from two-part episodes that featured Ghidorah and Gondor-Gilis, this was the first standalone episode to reuse a Terror Beast, even though it's depicted as being an upgraded version of the former. If I didn't know any better, I'd assume that Jikaro was not supposed to appear in this episode at all, that it was actually meant for a brand new monster to make his first appearance. But at some point, the crew probably realized they didn't have enough of a budget or schedule to make a new suit. So to compensate for this, they up and decided just to put Jikaro in the episode and grant him some new skills, and essentially treating him as a new monster. If this is true, then the idea is almost reminiscent to what happened during the production of Gamera vs. Giron. When Tom and Akio first arrived on Terra, they witnessed an attack by a space form of the monster Gauss, which they quickly dubbed Space Gauss, who was quickly decimated by Giron. Originally, Daiei intended for a brand new monster to appear in this scene. Unfortunately, the crew discovered that they were too restricted by time and money to construct a new suit. So they decided to take the Gauss suit and one of its flying props, paint them both silver, and essentially treat it as a new monster. Unless I'm mistaken, it almost looks as though Toho did the same thing with this episode of Zone Fighter. And what a downer it is. By simply reusing an old suit without adding so much as a slight alteration to its form, Toho's efforts to create Super Jikoro just comes off as pure lazy. At least Daiei had the good sense to give Space Gauss a different color. It was a small change, but it allowed him to at least resemble a brand new monster. To save even more money and production time on this episode, they set all the monster action in the ocean instead of on land like every other episode that came before and after this. And even these shots don't always work very well. On the water's surface, the bottom of the sky backdrop is visible in multiple shots. Zone Fighter and Super Jikoro are clearly standing on some kind of ground below them, judging by how well they move and fight, despite being out in the middle of the ocean. And the two ships shown in the episode hardly even move or resemble anything remotely convincing. I never thought I'd bring myself to judge a tokusatsu episode based solely on its effects achievement. But here we are. These constraints on the budget are probably the reason why director Jun Fukuda wasn't too overly satisfied with his involvement with the series. Whenever he was asked about the show in interviews, such as a sit-down he had with David Milner in July of 1994, Mr. Fukuda's immediate response to the question was, "You don't have to mention that show." Cold. One thing he and Ishiro Honda mutually shared about giant monsters was that they are only meant to be shown on the large screen in a movie theater, instead of on the small TV screen in someone's bedroom or living room. On the other hand, effects director Teruyoshi Nakano felt that the size of the giant monsters worked better on the small screen. In 1994, during an interview with Cult Movies magazine about the experience of filming the effects scenes for television, he said, "We were shooting footage not only for the small screen instead of a large one, but also for a standard size instead of a wide one. I think the best screen size for monster movies is standard size. Giant monsters seem to be huge not because they appear to be so wide, but instead because they appear to be so tall." Jun Fukuda, however, disagreed with Mr. Nakano's theory, expressing his belief that, quote, "People watch television on a small screen in a well-lit room instead of a large screen in a dark theater. Because of this, I think television is not the right medium for giant monster movies." And personally, I agree with Mr. Fukuda's opinion. I think monsters can look large enough, no matter what size screen they're depicted on, but when it came to the larger budgeted productions made for the theater, high-speed cameras were utilized to help display the sheer mass of the enigmatic beasts. For television, though, due to the budget constraints, the high-speed cameras weren't used as often, resulting in monster action scenes, as well as on-screen battles between two or more monsters that were moving at a speed that was rather unusual for their massive size. And Zone Fighter was by no means an exception. With the giants moving at such an excessive motion 90% of the time, the content almost always devoids itself of the imaginary sense that these creatures are meant to be gigantic, and not just regular-sized men wearing rubber suits.